Hey, I'm Stephanie, and it's time for a cheek palette declutter. If you've been following me for a while, you might notice these aren't my typical surroundings, and that's because I'm on the road. But I pre-recorded my declutter of all of my powder cheek palettes before I left, so that's what you'll be watching now. These are all of the goodies that I consider face palettes. Some of them are more multi-purpose than others. For example, these two are highlighting palettes, these two only contain blushes, these two only contain eyebrow things, and then there are other palettes in here that are more multifunctional. For example, this one has a multitude of different cheek products. So, I'm wondering where to start, and I have a feeling the most logical place would probably be to start with the things I am most likely keeping, because then hopefully I will be able to keep in my head what I already have, and then it might make it easier for me to let go of some of the other things. So let's start with these palettes, because these are things that I constantly take with me when I'm traveling. These are my go-to palettes when it's go time. There have been occasions when a colleague has called me up while they were on tour because they got sick mid-tour, and I had to step in and cover a couple of gigs for them. And on those occasions, oftentimes, all I had time to do was pack a bag and leave. And these palettes are absolutely perfect for that because they are not only all-in-one palettes, as we will see, but they are also extremely thin, lightweight, and easy to pack. Let's start with these two so that we can make some more room for the more colorful palettes. This is actually the same palette. I'm not sure that Bobbi Brown makes this anymore, which is a shame because this is probably the best travel palette or one of the best travel palettes I've ever had for complexion products. It contains a color corrector, a concealer, a foundation, a setting powder, and a bronzer. And it is just the most convenient format because it's so lightweight. And these little trays can be popped out. And that's why I've been saving this one. I feel like it doesn't make much sense because I have doubles of things now. But what happened was I used up these, so I cleaned out the pans. And I'm hoping that I can refill them with other things. Perhaps I could put my Charlotte Tilbury corrector in here, or maybe I can put one of my RCMA foundations in here, things like that. And so I've been keeping it for that purpose. But these two powders just kind of hang around because I have these powders, which are the same, and they're in an active palette, which just makes more sense. So part of me is wondering if it's simply time for me to get rid of these powders and just kind of remove the powders from the pans and keep these pans. Because I am the type of person who repots things. And because this format is so absolutely convenient, I think it might be worth me saving this palette as an empty palette that I can fill myself. But I do feel kind of wasteful because these powders are still perfectly good. So I don't know, what would you do in this situation? It's kind of a dilemma for me. But no matter what, I'm going to keep this palette because it is still in active use, and I really enjoy this bronzer. I really like the powder. It's not my favorite, but when I'm on tour and things need to go fast, it works. But I think this is the Stone Street bronzer. And let me see if I have my Bobbi Brown compact here with, I think, Stone Street in it. I have the same bronzer 3 times, which doesn't make much sense. And so I think what I'm going to do is this one is easy to give away. So I think I'm going to declutter this because this is gorgeous. It's absolutely beautiful. And if I can get the same effect with this powder, then why should I keep this single version? So I think I'm going to keep this and justify this to declutter that, which is great. And this is going to go on the chopping block. Maybe you can help me decide what to do with it. These are the Charlotte Tilbury Instant Face in a Palette palettes. And They are so convenient. That's all I can say. I have them in a bunch of different color stories. This one's just kind of like my own personal one when I'm just kind of going on maybe a weekend trip with friends and I'm not having to look particularly special, because this is really almost like a no makeup look, but I just really enjoy it. So this one I'm going to keep for my own personal use. These, however, I also use, for my own personal makeup, but they're also pretty darn useful for the stage. And as you can see, there's a couple of different looks in each one, and therefore it makes sense for me to keep these. I think the only one that Charlotte still makes is this one here. This is called the Pretty Blushed Beauty Instant Look of Love in a palette. And this just creates this beautiful, natural, but a little bit warm look. And I just really like this sparkliness on the eyelid. It's kind of like a topper. This is just a beautiful satin. This is a perfect matte for me. So, and I like the fact that in this palette, there's not a highlighter. This is a face powder. Every single one of the other palettes has a highlighter. And what I actually like about it is that the highlighter is made to fit the color story. So the highlighters are actually different in every palette. Like this one is more golden and this one is more beige. Perhaps if I put them next to each other, you can see. And I really enjoy that because I think that Charlotte Tilbury does a great highlighter. And these palettes are actually what has kept me from buying that classic Hollywood Superstar Bronze and Glow palette, the little duo. I have wanted that thing ever since it came out, and that must have been, I don't know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And I never bought it because at one point I bought one of these and realized I had the same product in a different format. And even though I think that palette is just kind of classic Hollywood and very nice looking as an item in and of itself, these are just more utilitarian for me, and it's definitely worth keeping all of these. I also have a feeling I'm not going to want to pair with these for either. And they're not quite as multi-purpose as these palettes because they don't have the eyeshadows that these palettes do, but they are multifunctional cheek products. For example, this is one of my absolute favorites. If I could only choose one, I think it would actually be this one. This is the Charlotte Tilbury Nudegasm Face Palette, and it's got a highlighter, a blush, a bronzer, and a contour powder, and these are just gorgeous. I really like this formula. I like these colors. This is a palette that I definitely want to keep and I want to, I think, bring with me when I travel this summer. So this one is going to stay. This one here by Nars, I'm definitely keeping because I unexpectedly decluttered a palette yesterday. My niece came to visit me and we were sitting around talking and we were playing with makeup, and she had asked me if I had ever tried the Patrick Ta blush duos. And I said, yes, I do. I have them. Do you want to play with them? And she's like, oh yeah, definitely, because they're very hard to get over here. I don't think that Patrick Ta is in Sephora, Germany. So she's never had an opportunity to see a Patrick Ta blush in person. She's only ever seen them online. And so she got to play with one and she was so excited about it. And I just figured I have one single, and then I had the trio where it had the 3 blush duos in it. And I just figured she was getting so much joy out of that, and she doesn't have an opportunity to travel as much as I do. So it's harder for her to get that sort of thing. And I just figured, you know what? The look of joy on her face just playing with this is so fun. I think I want to give it to her. So I unexpectedly decluttered that palette yesterday and no longer have it. But that was my fun, colorful summer blush palette. The only thing is, this palette by Nars, this is the Nars Orgasm, I think. Well, of course it's Orgasm, it's Nars. Orgasm on the Beach palette. And this actually gave me a very similar look to that Patrick Ta palette. And except that this one has the added benefit of a highlighter. And so I feel like this is now my one summer very kind of punchy, very colorful blush palette. And I think it's probably better suited for the way I do makeup simply because it's powders. And creams do tend to go off faster than powder. So I think me giving that Patrick Ta palette to my niece is probably a smart idea because she's going to get a ton of use out of that so quickly, whereas I tend to go through things more slowly. And so I think this is just more my speed. So I'm definitely going to keep this. Then we have my Hourglass face palettes, and I have two of them. One is more suited to me for summer, and one is better for me in the winter. This is definitely my summer palette, and this is what I use in the winter. And there's a couple of reasons why I like these. Number one, the finish of Hourglass is unsurpassed. Their powders are amazing. I really enjoy their blushes, their finishing powders, their highlighters, their bronzers, everything. It's great. So alone for the quality, it's worth keeping these palettes. But there's another reason I like these, and that is that Hourglass comes out with these absolutely gorgeous palettes that look very similar to these every single year around the holiday time. And every single year, for years now, I've been able to say, oh, I don't need that because I already have a summer palette and a winter palette by Hourglass. So I don't need to spend any more money on that new palette. And alone for the fact that these keep me from buying the new palettes every year, I kind of feel like they're worth it. So although they would stand on their own merit because I use them a lot, you'd never be able to tell, but they do stand on their own merit, but I do think that they're worth keeping also because they keep me from spending money. But there is something I'd like to consider, and that is that this palette has a finishing powder in it called Diffused Light, which I also happen to have an entire single of right here. Now, what I like about this single is that the pan is bigger because I typically use a powder like this to finish my makeup after everything's been done. So I will apply all my creams, then I will set them with all my powders, and then I will go in with a buffing brush like this. I'll swirl it around in here, tap it off, and then I will gently swirl it around my face, kind of mix all of the powders, blend them together a little bit, and this gives me a gorgeous finish. And I really like the way it works with a buffing brush like this. But if I try to put this in this powder, it's going to be very hard for me to swirl it because I'm going to be getting it into the blush and into these other shades. And so I'm wondering if it's smart for me to keep this or if I should consider decluttering it. And here's what I'm thinking. I have long wanted a smaller sized buffing brush. I've just been kind of putting it off for a while, but my plan is to purchase the Sonia G mini buffer as soon as it comes back into stock, because it's been on my wish list for so long and I've been saving up for it and I have a specific use for it. So I think now is a good time to buy it. And that one I think is going to be smaller than this Heavenly Luxe brush number 6 from IT Cosmetics. So I think what I'm going to do is I am going to put this back in my everyday makeup drawer for now, but I am going to purchase that Sonia G brush whenever it happens to come back into stock. And then I will see how that brush works with this powder. And if it happens to be small enough, then I think I can give this one away and simply live with this one. If not, then I kind of have to think about what I want to do, and I might end up keeping this. But I think now is a little bit too early. It's a little premature to declutter this. So these will be staying. Now we're getting into the single purpose items. So we have a blush palette from Zoeva and one from Sephora brand. First of all, the quality of these is amazing. I really enjoy the quality. So if I declutter them today, that won't be the reason. But what I do find is that when I'm doing my makeup at home, I tend to reach into my collection of single blushes to create a blush look. And when I'm on the road, I typically have an option like a palette like this that has several different options for me. And I'm not going to take one of these because they just don't cover enough bases. They're not utilitarian enough. And so I think there is a lesson for me to learn here that I need to carry forward in the future. And that is that I simply do not use blush palettes, even if their quality is amazing, because that is in these cases. So I think it would probably be better for me to declutter these to someone who would get a lot more use out of them, especially considering how beautiful they look. The one thing that is keeping me from instantly decluttering them is this shade right here. This shade is a nude blush, and my favorite nude blush. This is Nude Pop. This is my favorite nude powder blush currently, as we can see from the usage here. This is one of my favorite blushes because it's really almost impossible to overdo, and I just really enjoy the fact that it really is pretty darn nude. But I do wish that it was slightly darker because I do have to build this up. And so I am going to be needing a new nude blush soon. And this one seems like it would be a great candidate because look at this. I'll swatch it next to it. It's just a little bit darker, but I think I actually like the color of this even better than this because it's just slightly pinky. I want a kind of warm toned, peachy toned blush, but this one seems to hit that sweet spot and it's perfect. But I also have this. This was decluttered to me from my mother. It's a Lancôme Blush Subtil in the shade Cedar Rose. And when I swatch this, what does that look like? Look how nude that is as well. Now this is even pinkier than this. This is actually the tone that I'm looking for. That's what I really like. But this will do. It is close enough. It's nude, it's pretty, and even though I really want this, I honestly think that whoever I give this palette to would just get more value out of it as a whole. So instead of depotting my favorite shade and then just giving 3 away, I think I'm just going to give this palette away as it is. Lesson learned. So let's take a look at 2 more single-purpose palettes. Here we just have highlighters. This is the Anastasia Beverly Hills Sun Dipped Glow Kit, with the exception of this shade. I believe this one came from the Sugar Glow Kit, and then these 3 came from the Sun Dip. So this is kind of like a customized highlighter palette. And this is another palette from Hourglass. It is the Ambient Lighting Palette in Dim Light, and Incandescent Light, and Radiant Light. And here are my thoughts. These highlighters are the only intense highlighters that I own that give me a great option for glass skin. And in that sense, they are original to my collection. But in the same way that I didn't often use the blush palettes, I find that I don't necessarily always reach for this. So I'm going to try to keep that in mind. Let me swatch these for you so we can see them. I do really like using these with a fluffier fan brush and doing a light dusting on the cheeks. That's how I get that glassy look with this formula. When it comes to these, they're very different. This, first of all, is a finishing powder in dim light, and the finishing powders do have a luminosity to them, but it's nothing like a true highlighter. Then we have, is this, I think, incandescent light? Yeah, incandescent light here. And then we have radiant light here. So let's do some swatches of these as well. And here are my thoughts on these powders. Dim Light is a beautiful finishing powder, but it is a little bit cooler toned. That's not necessarily a problem with these powders because I'm not typically wearing enough for it to truly affect the color of my skin, but it is a little bit harder for me to use than Diffused Light, which is a more perfect match. So that's speaking against keeping this palette. Another thing speaking against keeping this palette is this particular shade. It's gorgeous. This shade is Incandescent Light, but it reminds me very much of a Laura Mercier highlight that I have. It's a very similar consistency. It has a soft luminosity to it, but it also has tiny little sparkles in it that are gorgeous. So I use those 2 things for the same reason, and there's no reason for me to keep both of them. But here, is the real issue. Because Radiant Light here, although it's too dark and orange for me most of the year, I can pull this off nicely in the summer, but I would say there's only a good month out of the year when I can really use this shade. However, what I typically do when I use this palette is I mix these two together. So let's do that so we can see that. And I get a nice peachy shade. And it has this beautiful soft luminosity, a gorgeous shade of peach that perfectly suits me. And I do not have any other peach highlighter. And I do like a light unsaturated peach highlighter. And that's what this gives me. So I'm kind of stuck because I don't use this palette all that often, except when I'm going for that peachy highlighting look. And I'm not sure it's worth keeping. So let me think of this logically for a moment. Okay. When I use this, it's because I want a peachy highlighter look. And one of the reasons I don't use it that often is because it lives in a separate drawer. It's not in my everyday makeup vanity where I have all of my blushes and highlighters and cheek products. And so I'm wondering, this would fit in that box now that I've decluttered it. I'm wondering if maybe I should store this with my single highlighters for a while and see if it gets more use that way, because I do enjoy these mixed together so much. So I think that's how I'm going to solve that problem. I'm going to do an experiment and keep this in with the rest of my normal single highlighters for a while and see if I get more use out of it. And that'll be that. With this one, I am wondering, now that I am starting to declutter everything, if I will get more use out of this, because there are occasions where I do want a glassy skin look, and this is what I use to get that. It's not that I do it every day, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was a couple times a month. And for me, I feel like it's worth it because I enjoy makeup. This is my hobby, and it's not a theoretical. It is something that I actually do. It is a look that I actually semi-regularly create. So my options would be, I can either keep this palette, and I would have to keep it in with the rest of my face palettes because that's the only place that it fits. But I could also declutter this and simply purchase one highlighter, one single highlighter in a more glass skin form. I don't necessarily want to buy a new highlighter right now. And so I am wondering if maybe I will also test this. Now that I'm kind of thinning out my makeup collection, perhaps now is a good time for me to put this back and see if it now gets more use because I have less to choose from. So I think that's what I'll do. Here we have two palettes solely dedicated to eyebrows. And that might seem a little bit excessive, but I am essentially the opposite of Hope Miss Tom. They're not so into eyebrows. I'm very into eyebrows. Maybe because I'm blonde and they tend to disappear at the very first ray of sunlight. If there's a single photon in the room, poof, they're gone from my face. And so I like to have some control, add my eyebrows back in so that they're visible, and these palettes help me do that. But another reason I like having eyebrow palettes is because sometimes, every once in a while on stage, I will wear a wig. And when I do, I like to have these different options because then I can match my brows to the color of the wig that I'm wearing. So that's useful. What are the advantages of these two palettes? Well, first of all, they're both great quality. This is Zoeva, this is Viseart. What I like about the Viseart palette is that it also has these waxes in them. And these are a great combination with these powders. They kind of give me a little bit more hold, a little bit more intensity, and I like that. What is missing from this palette for me is these shades here in the Zoeva palette, which are highlights. And you have one matte highlight, and then one kind of golden highlight and one cooler colored highlight. And what I enjoy about these formulas is these two, for example, are shiny, but the formula isn't thick or silicone-y. They're the ideal underbrow highlights. And this matte shade is also perfect when I'm going for a more matte look. So I've always enjoyed using these. And of course, these powders also work very well. But when I look at these colors and these colors, they are very similar. What I do see is that I get more color options with the Viseart palette. So I think if I could only keep one, it would probably be this one. And maybe, Stephanie, you're being excessive. I mean, I do only have 2 eyebrows. I might be obsessed with them, but there are only 2. So I think what I'm going to do is pass this palette on, and I will keep this one. And I think I can be happy with that because I do also have this palette from Danessa Myricks. This I do also use for my eyebrows pretty frequently nowadays. And so the question is, do I really need to keep the Viseart and the Danessa Myricks? The answer is probably not. So let's take a closer look at the advantages of these. The Danessa Myricks has a putty formula and a powder formula for every single color, which I think is genius. I really enjoy this format and I use both the putties and the powders regularly. The difference between these putties and these waxes is that these are a little bit stickier, but they're also less pigmented. And that might surprise anybody who knows or has used this palette before, because the putties in here, for example, when blended out on the eye, don't have a whole lot of pigment. You really have to build them up and then set them with the powder to get a whole lot of payoff. But when I'm using this formula on my brows, I'm using it with a very thin, tightly packed brow brush. And that brush does tend to deposit a lot of color underneath my brows. So if I'm trying to really fill in my brows and give them a lot of depth, this is good. But what I enjoy about this is the fact that I can get kind of a transparent-ish base with these. It's a little bit more subtle, a little more natural looking. And then I can also, of course, use the powders to create whatever look I need. And so in a way, I do feel like I get 2 different brow looks when I use these 2 different powders. So I'm not sure I'm willing to part with Viseart just yet. So now the question becomes, what do I do with this Bobbi Brown palette? This powder is decent. It's not the best, but it's not the worst. This bronzer, however, is really nice, and it does feel kind of wasteful for me to just get rid of the powders so I can use this container. It also seems like it would be a whole lot of inordinate effort if I were to take these powders out and then press them into new pans and then give them away. It just feels like a lot of work for what it's worth, and I'm also not entirely sure who would want them. What seems most wasteful to me is if I don't keep this palette, empty it out, and reuse it, because I am the perfect candidate for something like that. I travel all the time. I am perfectly willing to repot cream products into a palette like this and take it on the road with me. And this format is so thin and lightweight that I really enjoy it. So the worst thing I could do, I think, would be to get rid of the palette. This component already exists. This plastic is already in the world, and I feel like I should make the most of it for as long as I can, because that's the way that we can create the least waste, is by reusing the things we have. But I really am kind of torn about what to do with these powders. So I think what I'm going to do is, I have decided I am going to keep this palette for myself, but I am going to empty it. And the only question now is, what do you think I should do with these powders? Do you think I should go through the effort of repotting them into other pans to give away? Or do you think that I should just ditch the powders? Let me know in the comments. So we are left with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 palettes. And this one and this one, so these two here, are in the observation category. We're going to see how I interact with these now that I will be storing this palette with my highlighter singles. And this will now have more space to breathe in my collection. And we'll see if that means that I actually use it more. We also have this in that same category. This is that Hourglass finishing powder in diffused light, which I also have in this palette here. So I am going to see when I buy my new smaller buffing brush, which will be more suited to my face, if that new smaller buffing brush will also fit into this smaller pan. And if it does, then I know that I can give this one away because I don't need two of the same thing. And if not, then I know that it's worth keeping because it's a very practical size. And we're decluttering 1, 2, 3, 4.5 things because this palette's only half full. Even though it wasn't the most dramatic of declutters, I was pretty satisfied with the end result. Number one, because I did manage to cull a couple of things that deserved new homes, but also because I learned an important lesson. Blush palettes are just not for me. So I think going forward, that will be useful information. So alone for that reason, this declutter was useful. I hope you'll like, comment, subscribe, maybe even watch another video, all that jazz. But even if you don't, I hope you have a great week. And we can all remember that even stumbling can be a form of moving forward. So let's stumble in style.